Sophie here from Laughing with Lizzie. Today I am going to be doing a reading from Sarah Johnson, the lovely Sarah Johnson's latest story, Just to Hear I Love You. It was an honour to be asked, and it also gave me a lovely opportunity to dress up in my Regency outfit again. So, Just to Hear I Love You. January 1799. Cold. So cold. She could not open her eyes because of the shooting pain it caused. She had to fight. Move, she told herself. Tiny pinpricks all over her body. She could not continue like this. She had to stop. She needed to be warm. Suddenly she felt her body go limp, floating in a weightless suspension somewhere. Where am I? Suddenly everything changed. Even without opening her eyes, she could tell the difference. Warmth encompassed her whole being, and she no longer felt the sharp pain of needles poking her. Opening her eyes, she saw that she was standing in a field of flowers. The sun shining overhead was just enough to be bright and warm, but not overpowering. She looked all around. As far as her eye could see were rolling hills, fields covered with flowers of every kind. It was like looking at a rainbow poured out over the lands. Off in the distance, she noticed a tree on top of one hill. She wondered about its lone existence, and suddenly she was there, beneath its shade. She turned all around, twirling her petticoats. Then she saw someone. She stumbled to a stop and looked at the lady who appeared before her. "Mamma? Is that really you?" The little girl standing by her side looked just as she imagined her baby sister would have looked at that age. "Lydia?" The lady reached down and grasped the hand of the child beside her. Then she turned to walk away. Suddenly she turned back, reaching her hand out to Mary, the words coming from her lips echoing in Mary's mind. "Come with me, my child. I love you." She stretched her arm, trying with all her might to reach them, but the harder she reached, the further away they became. Everything around began to fade. The sunlight grew dim, and the flowers on the distant hills disappeared. Mary looked all around, and when she looked back to where the tree should have been, there was nothing. Complete darkness encompassed her world. She felt her way a few steps, but was so unsure of her footing that she stopped. "I cannot see! No, I must be able to see." She collapsed on the cold ground below her, the darkness engulfing her to the deepest part of her soul. She did what any young girl of 8 years would do. She began to cry for her papa, until she was so tired she could no longer remain awake. Finally she gave in to the drowsiness, and sleep overtook her. Heaviness surrounded her. Her arms were weary, and something was weighing down her entire body. Slowly she opened her eyes, and the familiar surroundings of her room came into view. The once bright floral wallpaper was faded and peeling, just as she remembered. The bed curtains were pulled back and tied at the corners of the bed. A chill in the room was driven away with the roaring fire in the fireplace, but something was wrong. She looked around and saw her father sitting in the chair across the room. His head was resting on the wing, and one leg was crossed over the other, and an open book laid across his knee, just as she remembered him. She smiled and tried to sit up. Suddenly she saw someone come running into the room, making it to the side of the bed before Mr. Bennet could. "Elizabeth!" Oh, she looked so tired. She was saying something. Her lips were moving, but nothing was coming out. Mary's brow furrowed, and she looked around at the faces now surrounding her bed. Elizabeth, Papa, Aunt Phillips. The next face that came into view was that of Dr. Jones. He was saying something to the others. Then he reached out his hand and felt her forehead. His fingers were ice cold, and she cringed at the sudden feel of them on her skin. Aunt Phillips was nodding at what he said, and then she handed him a cup of tea. He turned back and lifted her head, helping Mary drink the awful-tasting liquid. Then he helped her lie down again, pulling the blankets high about her neck, and tucked her in all around, all the while talking to the others. Nothing. She heard nothing. Not a sound, not a twinge, not even what one would expect to hear when you put your fingers in your ears to hear your own heartbeat. Silence. Deep, dark silence. Then everything went black, once again as sleep overtook her body. When she awoke again, she saw Elizabeth sitting in the chair that had now been moved to right beside the bed. Elizabeth was holding Mary's favourite book in her hands, one their mother read to them often. It contained lists of flowers and what meaning they held, as well as pretty drawings throughout, some from the author and others drawn by their mother. Mary looked back to Elizabeth's face and realised she was reading aloud, but once again nothing was heard. She reached up to her ears, pulling at them frantically, as tears began to well in her eyes. She felt her father's strong arms wrap around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. She looked up into his eyes and saw him moving his mouth, but she did not know what he was saying. She could do nothing but cry in his arms. Even her crying was silent. The words she heard her mother say rang out in her mind. "Come with me, my child. I love you. I love you." Would she ever be able to hear those words again? Summer, 1807, 8 years later. The crowded coach ambled down the road. She was certain the letter that preceded their unexpected journey would arrive only hours before they did, and she hoped her uncle would think to have a footman waiting at the appointed stop. That was something they did not think about until after the missive was on its way. There was nothing they could do about it now. The heat of the summer day was making the conditions inside the carriage almost unbearable. Mary decided at the next stop she and Elizabeth would try to sit next to the window instead. Until then, she would remain in the tiny space available to them in the middle of the carriage, glad to at least not have to listen to the babe that was in obvious distress across from them. Poor thing, even he cannot handle this heat. The 4-hour coach ride would leave the two sisters a mile from their relations' home on Gracechurch Street, and they would have to walk from there. Luckily, their uncle did send someone to escort them. Neither of them knew exactly where they were going, but they followed closely as the footman led the way down the crowded streets of London. Before they knew it, the two stood before the door of an unfamiliar home in an equally as unfamiliar city. The bustle of the busy street faded around them, and they stood shoulder to shoulder, each grasping the other's hand as the footman knocked and then stepped back to enter through the servants' door. Almost immediately the door swung open and the familiar face of their aunt appeared. She embraced and greeted the two, and then ushered them into the small home and into the sitting room. Mary sat where their aunt indicated, taking a cup of tea when it was offered, and watched as Elizabeth spoke with their aunt of the tragic events the two had left behind in Hertfordshire. Mary looked down, refusing to know what was said. It was too much to bear in detailing the loss they had suffered all over again. Finally she felt someone touch her arm, and she looked up into the teary eyes of her aunt. The words that formed on the lady's lips would forever be forged on her heart. "You are welcome to live here with us, both of you." Her life was not one filled with much acceptance, even from the small neighbourhood in which she had spent the entirety of her 15 years, but she knew somehow that they would make a life here. Elizabeth reached over and squeezed her sister's fingers. Then she signed, "Uncle has gone to Hertfordshire and will return when everything has been settled." Having never been as proficient at signing as her nieces were, Madeline let Elizabeth do the service for her, as she told them both of the black crepe, muslin and bombazine materials already being pulled from the shelves at their uncle's warehouse. They were to be fashioned into the mourning clothes the two would be required to wear for the next year. Some material had already been draped around the home on the doorways and in the proper places, and Madeline's maid was currently dyeing a dress for her to wear until more could be fashioned in the coming weeks. Black ribbon had been delivered already and was to be placed appropriately by the household staff as the day wore on. Madeline reached for Mary's hand, and when the younger girl looked up at her face, she said slowly, "My maid is awaiting you above stairs, and bath water is being prepared already so you can wash the smoke from your hair." She smiled. Your uncle has even brought back some scented oil from his warehouse that may help." Tears filled Mary's eyes. She thought no one noticed, thought she was unseen in the dramatic hour since their family had suffered so great a loss. But her aunt saw what the girls needed and was prepared to do everything in her power to provide for their well-being. The tears began to run down her cheeks, and in the next moment her aunt's arms were around her in a strong embrace, her hand running soothingly through Mary's long and knotted hair. When Mary was finally calmed again, Madeline led the two up the stairs to the room they would be sharing. Then she went to the nursery to check on her own children. They were all asleep for their nap. She nodded to the maid who sat in the corner. When her husband returned from burying Mr. Bennet and their nieces, Jane and Kitty, who did also not make it out of the fire at Longbourn, they would need to discuss the possibility of moving to a larger home. With their 3 children and their nieces now living with them permanently, this one would become too small very quickly. She returned downstairs and sat at her desk, pulling out paper to begin the necessary letters to others who would need to be told of the family's loss. An hour later, Mary came back down the stairs. Finding her aunt at the desk, she retrieved a chair and sat, watching as she completed the task before her. Madeline looked to her niece and smiled. "You have always had lovely hair. Did the oil work in removing the smell?" Mary lifted a section of her hair and inhaled the scent, smiling slightly as she nodded her head. "Would you like me to help dip the edges of these pages in ink?" Mary nodded again, and her aunt helped her set up an area where the tedious task could be completed with minimal mess. When the two were done, Madeline retrieved the traditional black melting wax, and they sealed the letters, then stacked them on the desk to be posted the next day. Madeline stood and held her hand out to her 15-year-old niece. "Come, you can join me in the garden." She took the offered hand timidly and went with her aunt outside to the small space they had made into a garden. It was only large enough for one bench that seated 2 comfortably, but it was nicely designed and a peaceful retreat in the middle of the bustling town all around them. The high wall covered in ivy at the back was meant to keep the noise out and keep it to a minimum, but Mary would not notice such things. What she did notice was the spruce pine tree that grew in the back corner. She smiled as she recognised it from her mother's book of flowers. Hope in adversity. With a determined stride, she went to the tree and ran her hand over the needles, smiling when they made her palm itch. She had to believe what it meant was true. She had to hold on to the hope that all this would be a distant memory from them one day. She had to trust that the physical limitations that had held her back since she lost her hearing at the age of 8 would not become a deterrent to what the future held. She felt her sister come up beside her. "Are you well?" Elizabeth signed. Mary turned and signed back. "Yes, I am well. And you?" Elizabeth gave a small smile, and reaching for her sister's hands, holding them tightly in her own, she replied, "We are well." Saturday, May 11th, 1811, 4 years later. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Edward said to the visitors as he entered the sitting room. "We did not expect to see you today. I am sorry to say my wife and nieces are unavailable to greet you. We've been invited to a small gathering, which of course means they all need new gowns. Have a seat," he indicated the chairs. "Can I offer you some refreshments?" "Yes, thank you." Edward nodded to the housekeeper who left to prepare the tea. "Is there something I can help you with, or is this purely a social call?" "It is not purely a social call," Darcy replied, "but it is Miss Bennet with which I wish to speak." Gardner pulled out his watch, checking the time before he said, "I expect their return soon. Can I tempt either of you with a cigar while we await the ladies?" "Now that is something I will never pass up," Fitz replied. They enjoyed the friendly discourse in Mr. Gardner's study until they heard the ladies return from their excursion. Then they joined them in the sitting room. Greetings were exchanged, and Darcy, eager to speak with Miss Bennet, suggested they walk out in the garden. The 4 younger people went out to enjoy the bright flora surrounding them. The Gardners watched from the sitting room, both noticing that there was a great connection forming between Mr. Darcy and their eldest niece. Fitz was sitting on the bench next to Miss Mary and watching his cousin's interactions with Miss Bennet as Darcy led her slowly through the garden, when he realised how rude he was being. Turning to his companion, he said slowly, "I am sorry, Miss Mary. Please accept my apologies for not speaking with you." Mary nodded, the corner of her lips rising just a little. He looked around at the flowers. Picking one from the garden beside him, he ran his finger over the soft petals. "I have always heard tell that when one sense is lost, the others are heightened to help compensate. Is this true, Miss Mary?" She nodded, watching his lips carefully as he continued. "You know, I have met many a soldier who have been injured in battle, some who have even lost their hearing from being too close to a blast from a cannon as it was fired. Until now, I never really thought of the difficulties they must face in adjusting to the life after coming home." He looked at her for a moment before he quietly said, "Meeting you is starting to change the way I see everything around me." He held the flower out to her. "And I must thank you." Mary reached for the vibrant petals, their fragrant smell filling her nose as she lifted it and inhaled its scent. Looking back to the Colonel, she nodded her head in thanks, smiling fully when her eyes met his again. She then pulled out a notebook out of her pocket and began to write, handing it to her companion when she was finished. Fitz read the note aloud. "Do you know what these flowers around us mean?" Then he looked up to answer her. "No, I cannot say that flowers have ever been of much interest to me. Will you enlighten me?" She again wrote her answer, watching his reaction as he read aloud. "The royal oak tree, whose leaves we sit beneath, stand for bravery. The flowers we sit amongst have various meanings, but my favourite is the Chinese chrysanthemum. It will not bloom until the leaves begin to fall from the trees, but its meaning is cheerfulness under adversity. Also, the spruce pine over there means hope in adversity. It is the adversity in life that has taught me to appreciate the small things that bring me cheer." Fitz saw in her answer the strength of character which carried her through the darkest times in her life. "You planted it here for this reason?" At her nod, he looked around them. "Did you plant all of these?" She once again took the pencil in her left hand and wrote her answer, then gave it back to him to read. "My aunt and sister helped with the planting, but I am the one who chose these particular plants surrounding this bench. It was my favourite place to sit when we first moved here, so my aunt suggested I have the choice of which blooms would surround it. My sister chooses for colour and visual appeal, while I choose purely for meanings, just as my mamma did in her garden." Fitz looked up once again after he read her explanation. "You fascinate me, Miss Mary. I would not have guessed such things meant so much to you. So what other hidden accomplishments do you possess, madam? Do you play the pianoforte?" She shook her head and chuckled at such a question. "Embroidery, perhaps?" She wrinkled her nose and shrugged her shoulders. He chuckled. "Not very well, I take it. What about painting?" She shook her head again and wrote, "I draw, but mostly just flowers and other simple objects. But I am working on doing people. My mother was an accomplished artist, but she never got to teach me." When he saw the words written with a shaky hand, he felt compassion for her. To lose one parent when one was so young, and then to lose the other just a few years later, it was a great deal to bear. "I shall have to talk you into showing me your drawings sometime. With your love of Flora, you will adore Pemberley." He immediately realised what he had said and stammered as he looked down. That is, if you ever have the chance to visit my cousin's estate." Mary's hand touched his arm, and he looked up at her face. "I am sorry, I forgot, I must look at you, otherwise you cannot tell what I am saying. I do apologise." She nodded and wrote in her notebook, handing it back to him. "It is clear to some of us just what the future holds for my sister and your cousin. I am happy for her. She deserves to marry the best of men." "I happen to agree with you. So what of you, Miss Mary? What is it you are looking for in a marriage partner?" "Me?" she wrote. "I will never marry." "Why not?" "Who would want me, sir?" she wrote, turning her head away when he verbalized what she wrote. Mary felt his finger on her chin as the gentle pressure tried to turn her back to face him. She turned, closing her eyes and swallowing hard. When she opened them again and met his eyes, she felt her pulse start to race at his words. Do not discount your own charms. Fitz reached over and plucked one of the blooms at his feet, handing it to her. Mary took it in her fingers and tried not to laugh, but it was too much to not at least smile with mirth. She wrote, "Do you know what this one means?" "No, I cannot say that I do." "This is one my sister insisted on having here beside my bench. It is a ranunculus, or a Persian turban, and it means, 'You are radiant with charms,'" she wrote. Fitz could not help but smile. "Well then, it seems I have chosen the perfect bloom for this moment." He could not bring himself to admit, whether aloud or even to himself, that he was indeed dazzled by Mary's radiant charms. There we go, there's a little excerpt from the upcoming book, and to me it sounds brilliant, and I cannot wait to read it. I will be reviewing it in the next few weeks, so watch out for that. Thank you again for listening to me. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you to Sarah for asking me in the first place. I hope you all read the book, and I hope you all enjoy it, and good luck to Sarah for the publication of Just to Hear I Love You. Thank you. Bye.